but I know you are Ryan Herzog, professor of economics at Gonzaga. I got that correct, right?
That is correct.
Okay. Just talking about President-elect Trump's post on social yesterday, or on Truth Social rather, stating that he plans to impose a 25% tariff on Canadian and Mexican goods imported into the U.S., as well as a 10% tariff on Chinese goods if those countries don't stem the flow of fentanyl and illegal immigrants, essentially. And as an economics professor, what would the impact of tariffs on those countries be to us here in the U.S.?
Yeah, so to start, tariffs and the effect of tariffs are pretty complex. So we have to make kind of two assumptions. The first assumption is that President-elect Trump is going to follow through with the tariffs. We've heard him make these threats before and not follow through. So that's one big assumption. And the second assumption that I think is even more critical is what is the Federal Reserve going to do? So this is where we've been trying to kind of understand how the central bank will respond. So we know when tariffs come in, if they do nothing, prices are going to go up, right? We import a lot of oil from Canada. So the Midwest, a lot of their refineries will depend on oil. We import a lot of cars from both Canada and Mexico. We import a lot of electronics from Mexico. So if the central bank does nothing, then the prices of those items are going to rise. When President Trump passed the steel tariffs, we saw both the price of foreign steel and domestic steel increase, which is what we would have expected. The reason why I'm bringing the Federal Reserve up is because households have just gone through this 2 to 3 year battle with inflation, and we know they are very sensitive to price increases. The central bank has made it very well. They've been very clear in their communication. They don't want inflation rising. So if these tariffs start to put upward pressure on these prices, like we would expect they would, my expectation is maybe we don't see inflation, but we will see higher interest rates as the central bank tries to keep inflation relatively down. So that's some of the complexities that make getting to a simple answer of what's the effect of these tariffs so complex.
Yeah, I mean, a tariff is essentially a fee or a tax, and so whoever's importing that good would pay that additional fee on top of that, and then they would likely pass that fee along to the consumer.
Well, and that would be ultimately where the prices start to rise. And as soon as there is that upward pressure on prices and eventually the inflation rate, we know the Fed's going to be pretty quick to try to tame that a little bit by either keeping interest rates higher for longer or even raising interest rates if it comes to it.
Sure.
So there's some of the dynamic that, again, like how does this affect the household? It's complex. If the Fed does nothing, then you are going to see, especially if you're in the Midwest, higher gas prices. You're going to see higher timber prices if you're in construction. You're going to see higher prices for the fruits and vegetables, mainly fruits that come in from Mexico, right? Your tomatoes and avocados. If you enjoy tequila, right? Those are going to be certainly going up in price. The bigger concern I have is if it is inflationary, those higher interest rates that the Fed's going to crank up to try to minimize that inflation.
Yeah. And then there's the issue of potential retaliatory tariffs those countries place on American goods. We're a net food exporter. I know that a lot of farmers, it's a high volume, low yield business. So any increased pressure they have on that end, it seems like it would hurt them too, especially in a state like Washington.
Yeah, Washington, we export, especially Eastern Washington, right? Where we're exporting a lot of wheat, a lot of apples, a lot of potatoes, a lot of hops. So, I mean, those are four of our biggest exports out of this state. So we saw, again, going back to the steel tariffs that President Trump first put on, China did retaliate, and they retaliated with tariffs on soybeans. Now, that didn't hit Washington State because we don't have a lot of soybean farmers in this state, but it certainly is an area where we kind of expect these countries are going to hit back into the areas that are going to hurt the most, which would probably be that agricultural sector.
Yeah. And a lot of people bring up the topic of, I think it was previously referred to as NAFTA. It's now like the USMCA. Would these tariffs violate that in some way, or is there any recourse for, I guess, different state governments or anybody else to sue to stop the tariffs?
So I think Congress has pretty much given the president unilateral ability to do that for national security, and he's making it under a national security claim with crime and fentanyl. So the only thing that I can suspect that can come out of the USMCA would be if the US levies tariffs, it provides Canada and Mexico the ability to retaliate and to match those tariffs in a way that is sponsored and endorsed. So again, I don't think there's going to be lawsuits with these tariffs, but it's certainly very likely to see something retaliatory from those countries. But again, going back to that original assumption of, is he going to carry through, knowing the Midwest was a big voter base for him, and if that results in higher gas prices in the Midwest, that's probably not going to be something that those voters are going to appreciate. So again, those are some of the challenges we're facing. Is there going to be carve outs? Is there going to be some loopholes in there for some of these sensitive industries? I don't know. But a lot of assumptions that we need to make to try to even understand how this is going to affect a household.
Yeah. So the caveats being, is he going to go through with them? And there was a second one you mentioned off the top, and it just slipped out of my head. And if
the central bank.
Guess if the central bank doesn't act, to reduce,
how will exactly? How's the central bank going to respond? Any hint of inflation above where we are right now, the central bank is going to raise interest rates. So is that something we want to absorb across the entire US economy? The housing market's already a bit sluggish right now. So again, those are some of the kind of assumptions we have to make to try to understand how it's going to hit the household.
And then talking about goods that are imported from Mexico, aren't a lot of US car manufacturers, don't they have plants in Mexico? So assuming that would impact the auto industry as well?
It would impact the auto industry very heavily because both countries are big importers of either vehicles or car parts into the US. So again, if those goods come in, 25% tariff on them, you will see some of that price increase getting passed through. Some will be absorbed by the company, but if they can pass it through, they will.
Yeah. It seems a bit unreasonable to think that they would absorb 25%.
No, definitely not. And it also, there's the argument of, is this going to be good for American manufacturers? And the answer is potentially, but it also leaves them some options of raising prices too. So any way you want to look at the tariff, you're not going to see lower prices in the US. You're either going to see higher prices directly on the goods we import from these countries, or you're going to see higher borrowing costs with higher interest rates. So either way, it's probably not good for the household.
Yeah. Well, I guess we'll have to just buckle up and wait and see what happens.
And I think that's it. I mean, I think there's, we know there's always a lot of rhetoric and a lot of statements that are being made. So it's going to be one of those key periods to see if he follows through.
Yeah. I guess I'm glad I refinanced in 2021 for a 2.2%.
Yeah, I think that's where a lot of us are, right? We're not moving anytime soon.
Turns out we have a forever home.
Yes, whether you were anticipating that or not. But that's also one of these consequences.
Yeah.
Home affordability is a challenge. And if the tariffs result in higher building costs on the construction side, that doesn't help. Or if they result in higher interest rates on the borrowing side,